Let's open up our Bibles to Deuteronomy chapter. Well, what we're going to do, it's very long parsha again today. So what we're going to do is we're going to read all of chapter 4 and 5, all right, and not do the rest because it's going to take a half an hour to read it all. All right, starting at Deuteronomy chapter 4. Now, Israel, listen to the laws and rulings I'm teaching you, in order to follow them so that you will live. Then you will go in and take possession of the land that Adonai, the God of your forefathers, is giving you. In order to obey the mitzvot, that's the commands of Adonai your God, which I am giving you, do not add to what I'm saying, and do not subtract from it. You saw with your own eyes what Adonai did at Baal Peor, that Adonai destroyed from among you all the men who followed Baal Peor. But you who stuck with Adonai your God are still alive today, every one of you. Look, I've taught you laws and rulings, just as Adonai my God ordered me, so that you can behave accordingly in the land where you are going in order to take possession of it. Therefore, observe them, follow them. Then all peoples will see you as having wisdom and understanding. And when they hear all of these laws, they'll say, well, this great nation is surely a wise and understanding people. For what great nation is there that has God as close to them as Adonai our God is whenever we call on him? What a great nation is there that has laws and rulings as just as this entire Torah, which I'm setting before you today. Only be careful. Watch yourselves diligently as long as you live, so that you won't forget what you saw with your own eyes, so that these things won't vanish from your hearts. Rather, make them known to your children and grandchildren. The day you stood before Adonai your God at Horeb, when Adonai said to me, gather the people to me, I will make them hear my very words, so that they will learn to hold me in awe as long as they live on earth, so that they will teach their children. You approached and stood at the foot of the mountain, and the mountain blazed with fire to the heart of heaven, with darkness, clouds, and thick mist. And then Adonai spoke to you out of the fire. And you heard the sound of words, but saw no shape. There was only a voice. He proclaimed his covenant to you, which he ordered you to obey, the 10 words. And he wrote them on 2 stone tablets. And at that time, Adonai ordered me to teach you laws and rulings, so that you would live by them in the land you are entering in order to take possession of it. Therefore, watch out for yourselves. Since you did not see a shape of any kind on the day Adonai spoke to you in Horeb from fire, do not become corrupt and make yourself a carved image having the shape of any figure, not a representation of a human being, male or female, or a representation of any animal on earth, or a representation of any bird that flies in the air, or a representation of anything that creeps along the ground, or a representation of any fish in the water below the shoreline. For the same reason, do not look up at the sky, at the sun, moon, stars, and everything in the sky, and be drawn away to worship and serve them. Adonai your God has allotted these to all the peoples under the entire sky. No. You, Adonai, has taken and brought out of the smelting furnace, out of Egypt, to be a people of inheritance for him, as you are today. But Adonai was angry with me on account of you, and swore I would not cross the Jordan, and go into that good land which Adonai your God is giving you to inherit. Rather, I must die in this land and not cross the Jordan. But you are to cross and take possession of that good land. Now watch out for yourselves, so that you won't forget the covenant of Adonai your God, which he made with you, and make yourself a carved image or representation of anything forbidden to you by Adonai your God. For Adonai your God is a consuming fire. He's a jealous God. And when you have had children and grandchildren and lived a long time in the land and become corrupt and made a carved image, a representation of something, and thus done what is evil in the sight of Adonai your God, and you've provoked him, I call on the sky and the earth to witness against you today, that you will quickly disappear from the land you are crossing the Jordan to possess. You will not prolong your days there, but you will be completely destroyed. Adonai will scatter you among the peoples, among the nations to which Adonai will lead you away. You will be left few in number. There you will serve gods, which are the product of human hands, made of wood and stone, which can't see, hear, eat, or smell. However, from there you will seek Adonai your God, and you will find him if you search after him with all your heart and being. In your distress, when all these things have come upon you, in the Achrit HaYamim, you will return to Adonai your God and listen to what he says. For Adonai your God's a merciful God. He will not fail you, destroy you, or forget the covenant with your ancestors, which he swore to them. Indeed, inquire about the past before you were born. Since the day God created human beings on the earth, from one end of heaven to the other, has there ever been anything as wonderful as this? Has anyone heard anything like it? Did any other people ever hear the voice of God speaking out of a fire, as you have heard, and stay alive? Or has God ever tried to go and take for himself a nation from the very bowels of another nation by means of ordeals and signs, wonders, war, a mighty hand, an outstretched arm, and great terrors, like all that Adonai your God did for you in Egypt before your very eyes? This was shown to you, so that you would know that Adonai is God, there is no other beside him. From heaven he caused you to hear his voice in order to instruct you. And on earth he caused you to see his great fire, and you heard his very words coming out from the fire. And because he loved your ancestors, chose their descendants after them, and brought you out of Egypt with his presence and great power, in order to drive out ahead of you nations greater and stronger than you are, so that he could bring you in and give you their land as an inheritance, as is the case today. Know today and establish in your heart that Adonai is God in heaven above, and on earth below there is no other. Therefore you are to keep his laws and mitzvot, his commands, which I'm giving you today, so that it will go well with you and with your children after you, and so that you will prolong your days in the land Adonai your God is giving you forever. Then Moshe separated 3 cities on the east bank of the Yarden toward the sunrise, to which a killer might flee. That is, someone who kills by mistake a person whom he did not previously hate. And upon fleeing to one of these cities might live there. The cities were Betzer in the desert and the flatland for the Reovini, Ramoth in Gilead for the Gadi, and Golan in the Bashan for the Manasseh. This is the Torah which Moses placed before the people of Israel. These are the instructions, laws, and rulings which Moshe presented to the people of Israel after they had come out of Egypt, beyond the Yarden River, in the valley across from Beit Peor, in the land of Sihon, king of the Amori, who lived in Heshbon, whom Moshe and the people of Israel defeated when they came out of Egypt. And they took possession of his land, and the land of Og, king of Bashan, the 2 kings of the Amori, who were beyond the Yarden towards the sunrise, from Aroer on the edge of the Ornon Valley to Mount Sion, that is Mount Hermon, with all the Arabah beyond the Yarden, eastward all the way to the Dead Sea, at the foot of the slopes of Pisgah. Then Moshe called to all Israel and said to them, "Listen, Israel, to the laws and rulings which I am announcing in your hearing today, so that you will learn them and take care to obey them. Adonai, our God, made a covenant with us at Horeb. And I did not make this covenant with our fathers, but with us, who are all of us here alive today. Adonai spoke with you face to face from the fire on the mountain, and at that time I stood between Adonai and you in order to tell you what Adonai was saying, because on account of the fire you were afraid, and you wouldn't go up to the mountain. So he said, I am Adonai your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, where you lived as slaves. You are to have no other gods before me. You are not to make for yourselves a carved image or any kind of representation of anything in heaven above, on the earth beneath, or in the water below the shoreline. You are not to bow down to them or to serve them. For I, Adonai your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sins of the parents, also the 3rd and 4th generation of those who hate me, but displaying grace to the 1,000th generation of those who love me and obey my commands. You are not to misuse the name of Adonai your God, because Adonai will not leave unpunished someone who misuses his name. Observe the day of Shabbat, to set it apart as holy, as Adonai your God ordered you to do. You have 6 days to labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Shabbat for Adonai your God. On it you are not to do any kind of work, not you, your son or daughter, not your male or female slave, not your ox, your donkey, any of your livestock, and not the foreigner staying with you inside the gates of your property, so that your male and female servants can rest just as you do. You are to remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. And Adonai your God brought you out from there with a strong hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore Adonai your God has ordered you to keep the day of Shabbat. Honor your father and mother, as Adonai has ordered you to do, so that you will live long and have things go well with you in the land Adonai your God is giving you. Do not murder. Do not commit adultery. Do not steal. Do not give false evidence against your neighbor. Do not covet your neighbor's wife. Do not covet your neighbor's house, his field, his male or female slave, his ox, his donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. These words Adonai spoke to your entire gathering at the mountain from fire, cloud, and thick mist in a loud voice, and then it ceased. But he wrote them on 2 stone tablets, which he gave to me. And when you heard the voice coming out of the darkness as the mountain blazed with fire, you came to me, all of your heads of tribes and your leaders, and said, Here, Adonai our God has shown us his glory and his greatness. We have heard his voice coming from the fire, and we have seen today that God does speak with human beings, and they stay alive. But why should we keep risking death? This great fire will consume us. If we hear the voice of Adonai our God anymore, we will die. For who is there of all humanity that has heard the voice of the living God speaking from the fire as we have and stayed alive? You go near. Hear everything Adonai our God says, then you tell us everything Adonai our God says to you, and we'll listen to it and do it. Adonai heard what you were saying when he spoke to me, and Adonai said to me, I have heard what this people has said when speaking to you, and everything they said is good. Oh, how I wish their hearts would stay like this always, that they would fear me and obey all my mitzvot, so that it would go well with them and their children forever. Go, tell them to return to their tents, but you stand here by me, and I will tell you all the commands and laws and rulings which you are to teach them, so that they can obey them in the land I am giving them as their possession. Therefore, you are to be careful to do as Adonai your God has ordered you. You're not to deviate either to the right or the left. You are to follow the entire way which Adonai your God has ordered you, so that you will live, and things will go well with you, and you will live long in the land you are about to possess. Amen. In our previous week's Torah portion, I approached our Shabbat teaching on Deuteronomy from the 30,000-foot view to present an overall picture of this 5th book of the Torah that focuses on the foundational principles that it teaches. Today, I'm going to take the first few minutes to review some of those fundamental promises and premises of Deuteronomy that we are expected to keep in mind at all times when studying this great book and the Bible in general. And then it seems appropriate to me that we review right along with Moses and the 12 tribes the words of the 10 commandments, since these are the foundational commands of God upon which the people of the Exodus, as well as modern people of faith, are to base our lives. At least that's our claim. Now, the first contextual background of Deuteronomy that we should recognize is that the laws being given to Israel, originally given at Mount Sinai and now repeated, somewhat expounded upon here in Moab, are from Israel's God, Jehovah. And this notion of a set of commands coming from God sounds rather simple and easy for us to accept. But just as there is but one God in existence was a totally new concept to the world and to Israel. In Moses' era, anyway. So it was equally as revolutionary that a God would then be the one to establish laws and rules that governed any particular human society. Up to this point in history, It had always been a human king whose prerogative it was to define justice, to declare what was right and wrong, what was legal, what was criminal. Now, for Israel, however, the common understanding was that the source of Hebrew societal laws and morals would be forever changed to that of their Hebrew God. Now, another context of Deuteronomy to be aware of is that those in Moab to whom Moses is about to repeat the same laws that he taught at Mount Sinai, laws beginning with the first series of 10 laws that are historically known as the 10 Commandments, they were not present when the law was first given, almost 40 years earlier, except perhaps if they were young children at the time, because that first generation of the Exodus who had witnessed the awe of what happened in Egypt and who had heard God's voice at Mount Sinai were now dead and gone. And apparently, they had not passed the teaching of it along as they had been instructed to do. And finally, we're going to notice as we move along in our next several Torah portions, some slight variation in how these laws are to be viewed and applied at this point in Israel's journey versus how they were to be viewed and applied 40 years earlier at the beginning of it. This is because the era of living in portable tents, you can't move houses built of stone, eating the manna that had been rained down from heaven each day as their staple food. You can't grow crops when you're on the move. Relocating from oasis to oasis for water, all this was essentially nearing an end. Therefore, Moses had to explain just how Israel was to observe and apply these laws and commands given at Mount Sinai, since Israel was about to stop living as a massive horde of wandering Bedouins and instead beginning a holy war for Canaan to be followed by becoming a more settled and sedentary people. And since the context of Israel's life and existence was on the verge of changing significantly, Moses knew he had to take it upon himself to reframe a number of things about how God wanted the people to behave and how to apply the laws and commands as given to them on Mount Sinai, but under an entirely new set of circumstances. Yeshua, in his Sermon on the Mount, was also preparing his people for circumstances that were about to change, and they would keep changing. And yet somehow, always, their behavior was to be constrained within the boundaries of the unchanging law. This is a God principle. It is a dynamic that has been nearly lost to the Judeo-Christian faith community. Rather, this faith community says, because history is of the past and change has happened, then God's laws and commands are in the past as well. And since Bible history is in the past, then so are the morals and the ethics and the behaviors that were demanded by God only for those of the ancient times, not now. Unfortunately, since the 4th century AD, there have been very few voices to challenge this erroneous theological mindset. It's rather easy to deduce from what we're reading in Deuteronomy that Moses sensed that this second generation of the Exodus had to be exhorted and taught not to abandon the law, but rather they should hear it again and learn how to adapt the carrying out of that law into what was an unknown and unpredictable future. And when we move to Deuteronomy chapter 5, we find that Moses is reestablishing the basis for claiming that he is the sole and unique mediator between God and Israel. That is, he is saying bluntly, these are the rules that I, Moses, proclaim to you. said that in verse 1, but then goes on to make it clear that he is but repeating to the 12 tribes what the Lord gave to him and what many of them heard as perhaps children out of a frightening and thundering voice from the sky. Moses is also reestablishing a basis to this next generation for why Yahweh is and should be Israel's God and why their loyalty is to be only to Yahweh. And the reason that Israel should obey and worship Yahweh is stated in the first commandment. That is verse 6. I am Yahweh your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. And I remind you that while it became the Christian norm beginning 16 centuries ago to ignore the original first commandment, I am Yahweh your God, and take the second biblically listed commandment and break it apart to make 2 commandments out of it so that the number of commandments could remain at 10, this is a significant error that has much to do with the Constantinian Church's historic bent to disinherit the Jewish people of their rightful place as God's favored people. It has also led to such an arrogant attitude of the Gentile-led church towards Israel that the very people to whom God's word was entrusted now feel alienated from their own Jewish Messiah. One other effect is that there has been a determined effort to replace Yahweh the Father with Yeshua the Son. That is, Constantinian Christianity wants to create this mental image as though the first commandment ought to read, I am Yeshua, your God. So, says Moses, the reason Israel should look to Yahweh and Yahweh alone is because it is Yahweh, not some other God, that rescued Israel from Egypt through never before seen signs and wonders. And let me say that a different way. It was not Jesus that rescued Israel from Egypt. It was the Father. And further, by now the Torah has established that it's folly to bow down to other gods because they don't even really exist. They are false gods, not only in the sense that Yahweh is a better and more powerful God, but rather in the sense that these gods are but figments of men's foolish and evil inclinations that so easily accept elemental spirits as gods and a myriad of created objects as things to be worshipped. We studied the so-called 10 Commandments in a great detail when we examined Exodus 20 quite some time ago. So we're not going to go into detail as those same commandments are but reiterated here in Deuteronomy 5. Instead, I'll only highlight the main points or indicate places where the wording of Deuteronomy 5 differs ever so slightly from Exodus 20. Now, from a panoramic viewpoint, we see that the 10 Commandments are divided into 2 obvious groupings. The first 4 speak of man's obligations to God, and the remaining 6 concern relationships among and between our fellow humans. Nowhere in the 10 Commandments, or anywhere in the law for that matter, does the direct issue of salvation come up. The law of Moses simply doesn't deal with salvation because that was never its primary purpose or function. The Israelites didn't look to the law for salvation because it wasn't there. So when we see Paul explaining, mainly to Gentiles, that the law was not able to save, he was simply telling his uninitiated listeners not to go seeking out the law as an alternative to do what only the Messiah could do. Paul knew that if they were not taught otherwise, the Gentiles would mistakenly assume that it was certain acts and behaviors that brought them their salvation. And when Paul was saying similar things to the Jews, he was telling these Hebrews that while obedience to the Torah law was good, it was important, that Messiah was doing something that Torah observance alone could never do. We do not find in the New Testament that Paul or Jesus or any other writer says that Christians should be antinomian. That is a 50-cent word that means anti-law. Rather, it was they should take advantage of Christ's ministry for salvation rather than mistakenly assume they had an option B, which was to obey a series of rules and laws in order to accomplish the same thing. Now, we've already discussed the first commandment. The second commandment is restated in verses 8 through 10, and it makes it clear that Israel is not to attempt to establish a relationship with any other god or god system. Now, that's pretty straightforward, and I'll not comment further on it. What I do want to point out is that the relationship nature of the covenant of Moses between God and man is solid. If you come from a traditional church background, as I do, then at some time you have no doubt heard pastors correctly say that faith in Christ is not a religion. It's a relationship. And the reality is that this is a fundamental biblical axiom beginning at creation. That the covenants between God and man are relationship-based. Therefore, we get the relationship-based formulaic words in Old Testament phrases like, I will take you to be my people and I'll be your God. From Exodus 6 and 7. In Leviticus, I will be your God, you shall be my people. God says, this is what I will be to you. Consequently, this is what you will be to me. And that while he offers this prospect of a harmonious relationship with him, it's up to each individual to accept it or reject it. That is the very definition of relationship as opposed to religion. Now, the third commandment is that the Lord's name is not to be misused. That is what is meant by not being taken in vain. Now, this may be the single most mischaracterized commandment of the 10. It is not the point of it to refrain from using the name of God perversely as a curse word. Rather, it is primarily about not invoking the name of God as surety in a vow or an oath that's either false on his face or one that the vow maker has no intention of keeping. This modern idea of an accidental mispronunciation of his formal name, Yehovah, as the point of this commandment, this seems to be especially prevalent in the Hebrew roots movement, or that we are to refrain altogether from saying his holy name, as in Judaism, is scripturally groundless. In fact, the Talmud makes it clear that the prohibition that the Jews eventually adopted, starting around 300 BC, of not uttering or writing the holy name had nothing to do with the third commandment. Rather, it came to be considered a matter of proper reverence. Now, the fourth commandment is to observe the Sabbath day. You know, there's so many new folks that have flocked to the Hebrew roots movement that I'm going to take a few minutes to explain this command. Please note that Sabbath is the proper name of a specific day, as opposed to it being the name of an activity. Any good Bible translation uses the wording, observe the Sabbath day. And while that is acceptable, it still misses the mark a tad, because when adding the Hebrew back in, it literally reads, observe the Shabbat. Shabbat is not just any day. It's a specific day that the Lord has ordained and set apart as holy. It is biblically defined as the seventh day of the week, not any day of a rolling 7-day period of our choosing. Further, it is the holiness of the day that's key. The Father has set this particular day apart from all others. That's what makes it holy. Can you or I declare something to be holy? Can a pastor, can a rabbi, can a pope take something ordinary and then legitimately make it holy? Making something holy lies 100% within the province of God and no one else. It is rightly quoted that Yeshua said that the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. But the point is not that the sole purpose of the Sabbath was so man would be able to take a day off of work. It was so man could enjoy and refresh his relationship with God and honor him as the Creator. The time off indeed is helpful for man and beast to rejuvenate. But mostly it was so man would remember it was Yehovah that created everything around us and that sustains us. Perhaps overriding all else is observing Shabbat's an act of obedience. Is it therefore a sin to ignore or even dismiss Shabbat? Well, of course it is. And yet, perhaps the bulk of the church says that the Sabbath is not only dead and gone, but that anyone who observes it is the one who's sinning. So in reality, the same church that nails a copy of those 10 commandments on its wall, by doctrine does not acknowledge the first commandment and says the fourth one doesn't apply to everybody in the room. Well, we've now reviewed commandments 1 through 4, which have to do with God's expectations that we, as his worshipers, acknowledge his name, his nature, his identity, and his weekly holy day. And upon commandment number 5, there's a shift. There's a shift to what the Lord demands of human-to-human oriented relationships. And these will specifically cover the obligation of children to their parents and how one is to honor and protect the life, person, property, and reputation of our neighbors and society at large. One could reasonably say that these are the humanitarian rules set down by Yahweh. Now, the 5th commandment actually describes our proper relationship to the first and most important humans in our life, our parents. Just as Leviticus 19, where the priests are admonished to revere their parents, so do the 10 commandments make it a duty, not just for the priestly class, but for all who wish to be a part of Israel, to recognize that among human relationships, obligations to one's parents reign supreme. Interestingly, this command is usually used to gain the attention of school-aged children when it comes to being obedient to their mothers and fathers. But that isn't how it was looked at in the various Bible eras. Rather, this was more about how grown children were to care for their parents when they needed it, and about how grown children were to continue to show deference to their elders. See, it's interesting that the issue is so high on God's list that in Leviticus 19:3, he essentially puts showing proper respect to one's parents as a human societal obligation on the same level as observing Shabbat as an obligation to our Heavenly Father, Yehovah. The commandment says, you shall each revere his mother and father and keep my Sabbaths. I am Yehovah, your God. Earthly parent and heavenly parent are to be honored and obeyed. It's also interesting to note that of all the 10 commandments, this one concerning the instruction to honor one's parents is the only one that promises a reward for all who obey. It says that by doing so, one's life will be prolonged on earth and that one will do well. Or better, will have well-being, will have shalom. Now the 6th, 7th, 8th, and 9th commandments are very brief. They're all contained in one verse. The sixth commandment is no one should ratzach. Ratzach is Hebrew for murder. It doesn't mean to kill. One could go hunting for a deer, for instance, and then be considered a murderer if the hunter accomplished his mission. The purpose for this commandment is very limited in scope, and it specifically means that a man is not to unjustly kill another human being. Legal executions are not a concern of this command. Death in battle is not a concern. Even manslaughter, in the sense of there being no intention to kill someone, nor is the death due to gross negligence, this is not a concern of this commandment. The key word is unjust or unjustifiable. And by the way, legal retribution by executing a person who has committed an unjust killing is expected, and it is demanded by the Lord. Now, the seventh commandment is that one should not engage in adultery. Now, biblically, adultery means consenting sexual relations between a married person and another person outside of that marriage. In some instances, it could also mean a wife taking the side of another man against her own husband in a serious disagreement. The Middle Eastern societies of this era all generally held extramarital relations to be a very bad thing. And most of these same societies punished the perpetrators severely, sometimes with death. In reality, a law similar to the seventh commandment was quite usual and customary among most societies in that era. Now, the eighth commandment is that one shouldn't steal. This means exactly the way we think of it today. We should not take something from someone that doesn't rightfully belong to us. Some rabbis said this commandment included kidnapping, the unlawful taking of a human being, although that's, I think, a little bit of a stretch. Rather, this is about personal property and about the prohibition against someone having their property unjustly taken away from them. The ninth commandment is that one should not bear false witness against another. In modern vocabulary, this is referring to perjury. It does not generally mean to avoid telling a lie in a conversation. Rather, this is more about making a false accusation of wrongdoing against someone that could lead to a criminal penalty. And it's about not telling the truth in a court of law that could either acquit the guilty or convict the innocent. Now, the 10th commandment is somewhat unique because while all the others speak of concrete actions and outward behaviors, this one that says that a person should not covet something that belongs to someone else is less about an action, it's more about a state of mind. Covet means to have secret desires, to make something yours that you have no right to. So certainly such a state of mind could eventually be manifest into an action to wrongly acquire what is being coveted. Yet, that's not the point of this commandment. The first thing one is not to covet is your neighbor's wife. That is, a man, married or not, is not to look in lust upon a married woman and decide to try to acquire her for his own. The next thing that is not to be craved or plans made to wrongly acquire is your neighbor's house. This does not necessarily mean your neighbor's dwelling place, the tent, the hut, or building one lives in. House is used here, means it in the sense of household. The people that form that extended family and often including whatever possessions come with it. Now, I've shared with you that it was the common mode of operation in most of the biblical eras for a clan or a tribe to increase their power and wealth by forcibly taking people, often entire households, along with all their possessions. And we had a direct example of this when Jacob's sons did this exact thing, when they stayed for a time at Shechem, and they took retribution for the rape of Jacob's daughter, Dinah. This dramatically increased the size of Jacob's tribe overnight because the Israelites acquired entire households of people. Well, the reiteration of the Ten Commandments is now complete, and Moses reminds the people that it was these 10 laws that the people heard directly from God. The 600 laws that came afterward were given to Moses, and then he passed them along to the people. And Moses also reminds the people that God was willing, and Moses would have been perfectly happy to continue giving his Torah directly to them from his own divine voice for all to hear, but their fear of the Lord's awesome presence drove them to beg Moses to ask God to stop speaking to them, and instead for Moses to behave as their mediator. See, here's the question that essentially Moses was asking of all the Israelites. Today, I ask all of you, do you really believe that those 10 commandments are alive and well and intended for you and your household? If your answer is yes, well, then we need to obey those commands and offer no excuse for why we don't.
For more teaching and information, visit us online today. Come and be a part of our fellowship. Here at The Seed, enjoy worshiping and learning God's Word with us.